Among the most memorable and inspiring pictures of World War II are those of his return to the Philippines to redeem his promise to those left behind. I shall return.
In February 1945, American soldiers raced toward Manila expecting to liberate a grateful city. Instead, they stumbled into a nightmare that no one saw coming. A rogue Japanese admiral had transformed the Pearl of the Orient into a fortress, and his sailors were about to commit atrocities so horrific that 100,000 Filipino civilians would die in just 29 days. This is the forgotten massacre that history tried to bury. MacArthur's promise fulfilled. On October 20th, 1944, General Douglas MacArthur stepped off his landing craft into the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. His boots sank into the soft sand of Red Beach on the island of Leyte. The moment MacArthur had dreamed about for 2.5 years was finally happening. Photographers captured every moment as the most theatrical general in American history waded ashore alongside Filipino president in exile, Sergio Osmeña. He walked to a portable radio transmitter set up on the beach and spoke words that echoed across the Pacific. "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our two peoples. For the millions of Filipinos who had suffered under Japanese occupation, these words meant everything. Liberation was finally coming. But the Japanese were not simply going to hand over the Philippines. They sent one of their most capable commanders to stop MacArthur. General Tomoyuki Yamashita arrived in the Philippines just 2 weeks before the American landing. They called him the Tiger of Malaya because in 1942, he had captured Singapore with just 30,000 frontline troops, forcing 80,000 British-led soldiers to surrender in the largest capitulation of British forces in history. Yamashita knew he could not defeat the Americans in open battle. He had nearly 300,000 troops on the main island of Luzon, but many of them were support personnel with minimal combat training. His strategy was simple and brutal. He would make the Americans bleed for every inch of Philippine soil. He divided his forces into 3 groups and prepared to fight a war of attrition in the mountains and jungles. The battle for Leyte was supposed to be quick, but it turned into a months-long nightmare. The Japanese poured reinforcements onto the island through 9 major convoys, adding over 40,000 fresh troops. Yamashita ultimately committed 80,000 soldiers to Leyte, and 97% of them died. Many starved to death in the mountains because American aircraft had cut their supply lines. While the fighting on Leyte dragged on, MacArthur was already planning his next move. On January 9, 1945, the invasion of Luzon began. General Walter Kruger's 6th Army landed at Lingayen Gulf with 68,000 troops on the first day alone. The beaches were eerily quiet. Yamashita had decided not to contest the landing. He was saving his strength for a prolonged defense in the mountains. But the kamikazes came. Between January 3rd and January 13th, Japanese pilots sank 24 American ships and damaged at least 67 more. The escort carrier USS Amani Bay went down. A kamikaze struck the bridge of the battleship USS New Mexico and killed the captain. It was a preview of the fanatical resistance to come. MacArthur was obsessed with one objective above all others: Manila. The capital city held thousands of American and Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees who had been suffering in Japanese camps since 1942. Every day that passed meant more of them would die from starvation and disease. MacArthur ordered his commanders to race for Manila at maximum speed. What no one knew was that a horror show was already being prepared inside the city. The race for Manila. On December 14, 1944, something happened on the island of Palawan that would haunt the Americans as they approached Manila. Japanese guards at a prisoner of war camp herded 150 American soldiers into air raid shelters and told them to take cover from an incoming attack. But there was no attack. The Japanese poured aviation fuel into the shelters and set them on fire. 139 Americans burned to death. 11 men somehow escaped to tell the world what had happened. The Palawan massacre terrified American commanders. They knew that thousands of prisoners and civilian internees were still being held in camps around Manila. If the Japanese were willing to burn men alive rather than let them be rescued, what would happen when American troops reached the capital? MacArthur ordered the formation of flying columns. These were fast-moving mechanized units that would bypass Japanese resistance and race straight for Manila. The 1st Cavalry Division led the way, and Brigadier General William Chase pushed his men to their absolute limits. MacArthur's order was simple and direct. Go to Manila, go around the nips, bounce off the nips, but go to Manila. Free the internees at Santo Tomas. The cavalrymen covered 114 miles in just 60 hours, sometimes racing at 50 miles per hour through Japanese-held territory. It was one of the most daring advances of the entire Pacific War. Meanwhile, in the jungles outside Manila, one of the most remarkable rescue missions of World War II was taking shape. The Cabanatuan prison camp held about 500 American prisoners of war, most of them survivors of the Bataan Death March who were too sick or weak to be shipped to Japan on the infamous Hell ships. Army Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas planned a nighttime raid to rescue them before the Japanese could carry out another massacre. On the night of January 30th, 1945, 121 Rangers under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci crawled through open fields toward the camp. Filipino guerrillas under Captain Juan Pajota set up blocking positions to stop any Japanese reinforcements. A P-61 Black Widow night fighter roared overhead to distract the guards. At 7:45 in the evening, the attack began. The Rangers stormed the camp and killed over 500 Japanese soldiers in a matter of minutes. They rescued 512 prisoners, many of whom were so weak they could barely walk. Filipino villagers arrived with carabao carts to carry the sick and wounded to safety. It was a perfect operation, but the men they rescued had been imprisoned for almost 3 years. Some of them did not even recognize the new American equipment and uniforms. 4 days later, on February 3rd, 1945, the flying columns of the 1st Cavalry Division reached the outskirts of Manila. At 9 o'clock that evening, 5 Sherman tanks crashed through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp. The lead tanks were named Battle and Basic and Georgia Peach, and their crews had no idea what they would find inside. What they found was almost 4,000 civilians who had been slowly starving to death. Many of them were women and children, including hundreds of American families who had been living in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded. The internees had been surviving on just 900 calories per day, and dozens had died from malnutrition in recent weeks. But the liberation of Santo Tomas was not simple. The Japanese commandant, Lieutenant Commander Toshio Hayashi, had taken 200 hostages and was holding them in the education building. For 2 tense days, American officers negotiated with Hayashi while snipers took position around the building. Finally, on the morning of February 5th, Hayashi agreed to march out with his men. They were allowed to keep their rifles and sidearms but had to leave their heavy weapons behind. As the Japanese column marched away from Santo Tomas, Filipino guerrillas ambushed them. Hayashi was killed, and 63 of his soldiers died with him. The nightmare of Santo Tomas was over, but the nightmare of Manila was just beginning. The admiral who refused to leave. General Yamashita had ordered all Japanese forces to evacuate Manila. He considered the city indefensible and wanted to preserve his troops for the mountain campaign, but one man refused to obey. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi was not supposed to be a hero. In November 1942, he had commanded the battleship Kirishima when it was sunk by the American battleship USS Washington during a night battle off Guadalcanal. It was the only time in the Pacific War that an American battleship sank a Japanese battleship in surface combat. The loss had brought shame upon Iwabuchi, and he had spent the last 2 years seeking redemption. When Yamashita ordered the evacuation of Manila, Iwabuchi saw his chance. He commanded the Manila Naval Defense Force, which included about 12,000 sailors and 4,000 army troops. Most of his men had little infantry training, but they had something the army troops lacked. They had weapons. Iwabuchi stripped anti-aircraft guns and artillery pieces from wrecked ships in Manila Bay and positioned them throughout the city. He fortified government buildings, hotels, and even the ancient walls of Intramuros, the old Spanish colonial fortress in the heart of Manila. Iwabuchi sent a message to his superiors that made his intentions clear. The headquarters will not move. Escape is believed impossible. He was going to fight to the death, and he was going to take Manila with him. The Americans had no idea what was waiting for them. MacArthur announced on February 6 that Manila was about to be liberated. He was planning a victory parade, but when his troops crossed the Pasig River and entered the southern part of the city, they ran straight into a wall of fire. The Japanese had turned Manila into a fortress. Major intersections were blocked with pillboxes and naval mines. Buildings had been reinforced with concrete barricades and firing positions. The Rizal Memorial Stadium had been converted into an ammunition dump with machine guns positioned on the baseball diamond. Every block became a killing ground. But the worst part was not the fighting. The worst part was what the Japanese sailors did to the civilians. The massacre. On February 3, 1945, as American troops were liberating Santo Tomas in the north, Japanese forces in southern Manila received an order that would lead to mass murder. Manila Naval Defense Force Order No. 43 instructed Japanese troops that when Filipinos were to be killed, they must be gathered into one place and disposed of with the consideration that ammunition and manpower must not be used to excess. What followed was one of the worst atrocities of the Pacific War. Japanese sailors went through the neighborhoods of Manila systematically killing civilians. They herded families into buildings and set them on fire. They bayoneted children in front of their parents. They raped women and girls, some as young as 12 years old, before murdering them. The Bayview Hotel in the Ermita district became a site of particular horror. Japanese soldiers rounded up 400 women and girls and selected the 25 most beautiful among them. For over a week, these women were repeatedly assaulted. One survivor named Esther Garcia Morris later testified that she was raped between 12 and 15 times in a single night. In the old walled city of Intramuros, the Japanese herded thousands of Filipino men into Fort Santiago. They poured gasoline on them and set them ablaze. They sealed others inside tunnels and left them to suffocate. A survivor named Dr. Antonio Gisbert later testified that he was one of only 50 survivors out of more than 3,000 men who were herded into Fort Santiago. The Japanese justified these killings by claiming that all Filipinos were guerrillas. Japanese military documents from the battle contained chilling entries. One soldier wrote on February 7th that 150 guerrillas were disposed of that night, and that he personally stabbed and killed 10. Another entry from February 9th recorded that 1,000 guerrillas were burned to death. But these were not guerrillas. They were ordinary civilians, families who had done nothing except be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The urban inferno. The Americans were now fighting two battles at once. They were trying to destroy the Japanese defenders while also trying to save as many Filipino civilians as possible. MacArthur had initially refused to allow airstrikes on Manila because he wanted to preserve the beautiful city he had once called home. But artillery was another matter, and as the battle dragged on, American guns poured thousands of shells into Japanese positions. The fighting was unlike anything American soldiers had experienced in the Pacific. This was not jungle warfare or island hopping. This was block-by-block urban combat in a city of nearly 1 million people. Japanese defenders had fortified reinforced concrete buildings that could withstand artillery bombardment. American troops had to develop new tactics on the fly. The 11th Airborne Division, which had jumped onto Tagaytay Ridge in early February, found itself facing a defensive network called the Genko Line. This line stretched from Nichols Field to Fort McKinley and consisted of 1,200 pillboxes, anti-aircraft guns, and machine gun nests. The paratroopers had expected a quick advance into Manila, but instead they spent weeks grinding through these fortifications. One officer named Major Edward Flanagan later wrote that from that point on, Their advance was not measured in miles but in yards. Meanwhile, the 37th Infantry Division was fighting its way through the government district north of the Pasig River. They captured Professor Island, where Manila's main power plant was located, after days of intense combat. Then they crossed the river in assault boats under fire and began pushing toward Intramuros. By mid-February, the Japanese were surrounded, but they showed no signs of surrendering. American commanders began to understand that they would have to kill every last defender to take the city. The walls of Intramuros. Intramuros was the oldest part of Manila, a 16th century Spanish fortress surrounded by massive stone walls that were 22 feet high and 8 feet thick at most points. Some of the bastions were even thicker, up to 40 feet at the base. The Japanese had packed this small area with their remaining defenders, and they had also packed it with Filipino hostages. American commanders knew that a direct assault on Intramuros would be costly. The walls could withstand normal artillery fire, so they developed a new approach. They brought up their biggest guns and fired shells without fuses directly into the masonry. These shells burrowed deep into the stone walls. Then they fired fused shells that detonated inside the masonry and blew it apart from within. On February 23, 1945, American artillery unleashed one of the most concentrated bombardments of the Pacific War. In just 1 hour, they fired nearly 8,000 artillery shells and 1,900 mortar rounds into the walls of Intramuros. 185 tons of explosives tore holes in walls that had stood for nearly 400 years. At 8:30 in the morning, infantry from the 37th Division stormed through the breaches. The 129th Infantry Regiment attacked from the north, while the 145th Infantry Regiment came through Quezon Gate. The fighting inside Intramuros was apocalyptic. Japanese defenders fought from every building, every rubble pile, every tunnel. American soldiers discovered horrors everywhere they went. Rooms were stacked with bayoneted and shot victims. Tunnels contained the bodies of people who had been sealed inside and left to die. The stench of death was overwhelming. Admiral Iwabuchi did not survive to see the end. On February 26, 1945, he and his remaining officers took their lives somewhere inside Intramuros. His body was never positively identified. The last Japanese resistance ended on March 3, 1945. The finance building fell that morning, and with it, organized Japanese defense of Manila ceased. MacArthur declared the city secure. The reckoning. The statistics of the Battle of Manila are almost too terrible to comprehend. Over 1,000 American soldiers died, and more than 5,500 were wounded. The Japanese lost at least 16,000 killed, with their bodies scattered throughout the ruined city. But the civilian toll was the true horror. At least 100,000 Filipino civilians died in less than a month of fighting. Some estimates place the number as high as 240,000. Historians have debated for decades who bears responsibility for these deaths. A Japanese post-war estimate attributed 60% of civilian deaths to Japanese atrocities and 40% to American artillery fire. But this division obscures a terrible truth. The Japanese deliberately murdered civilians as a matter of policy. The Americans killed civilians while trying to destroy the Japanese. Both were deadly, but they were not morally equivalent. The city that MacArthur had hoped to save was destroyed. Manila had been called the Pearl of the Orient, one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. By March 1945, it was the second most destroyed Allied capital of World War II, surpassed only by Warsaw. General Yamashita surrendered on September 3, 1945, nearly a month after Japan's official capitulation. He was put on trial for war crimes committed by Japanese forces under his nominal command, including the Manila massacre. His defense argued that he had ordered Manila evacuated and that the naval forces under Iwabuchi had defied his orders. The military tribunal did not accept this defense. On December 7, 1945, exactly 4 years after Pearl Harbor, Yamashita was found guilty. He was executed by hanging on February 23, 1946. His trial established what became known as the Yamashita Standard, the principle that military commanders can be held responsible for atrocities committed by their subordinates, even if they did not order those atrocities. The ruins of Manila stood as a monument to the terrible price of urban warfare for years after the fighting ended. Today, few physical traces of the battle remain, but the memory lives on in the families who lost everything in those 29 days when the Pearl of the Orient was reduced to ashes and blood. What are your thoughts on the Battle of Manila? Share in the comments.